Okay, today's daf we're going to be learning is Ketubot daf tet vav. Okay, it's a very interesting and basic daf. We talked about how Ketubot is shas katan or maftech hashas, right? The key to the shas. Today is one of those big sugyot about laws of majority, phrases that we're going to see many, many times in shas. So here goes. We started with this case, this very disturbing case of a young woman. Okay, she's called a tinoket. I want to be clear. Tinoket does not mean baby in the Gemara. Okay, we use the word tinoket in general in Hebrew to mean baby. In the Gemara, it's always used to mean a young woman. Okay, someone under the age of 12 usually, right? Unclear exactly what under the age of 12, but some young girl. Okay, this is Rabbi Yosi speaking. Just remember that we'll get to him later. So Rabbi Yosi says, there was a maseh b'tinoket. I'm back on your dalet. I'm a bet. She went to fill up water. And she was raped. Amar Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. What is his reaction? Right? Interesting. You think his reaction might be something else, but his reaction is, well, what do we do? Can she marry a kohen? That's what his issue is. And he says in Rava, we go by the majority of the people in the city. The majority of the people in the city are Jewish. Then we can assume that she can marry a kohen. Before we get to the issues it raises, I just want to point out that I definitely recommend you read Shuli Mishkan's article in Flashback about Tzippori in general, the city, which we're going to talk about in a minute, that this happened in Tzippori. And she talks more interestingly, what really interested me about her article was specifically the history is very interesting as well, and which is going to connect again with the next section. But the real interesting part is that she talks about that in the Gemara, in other places you see that they made all sorts of takanot in Tzippori of things that are not allowed to be done by women out of concern that they might get raped. And it's very possible that it was as a result of this action. So if you read this story and you say, you know, what are we talking about? Girls getting raped? Well, it seems that the rabbis were concerned about that and made precautions and told women don't do certain things so as to avoid getting into a situation where somebody might rape you. Okay, where they talk about whether it's going to the bathroom alone and where it was more dangerous, you know, and things that they should avoid doing so as to avoid situations like this, which is nice to see the reaction. Again, it's not clear it was a reaction, but it does seem like a possibility. In any case, it's just interesting. They made these takanot, but it definitely might be connected to this. So Amalei Rava le Rav Nachman. We ended with this question that Rava says to Rav Nachman, which we said must be understood on the assumption that the woman must have claimed that the man who raped me was a kosher, right? A kosher person, meaning someone who, if I had a relationship, sexual relations with him, it would still permit me to marry a kohen, meaning he was a regular Yisrael, he wasn't a mamzer, he wasn't a netin, he wasn't a halal, right? All those things. So now, Rava said to Rav Nachman, I don't understand this thing about holding by rove, because we said, if it's a matter of do we believe her or not, what did we say? Rabban Gamliel says she's believed, Rabbi Yehoshua says she's not believed, and both of them said it was irrespective of whether there was a majority of psulim or majority of ksherim, it doesn't matter. That doesn't factor in. To which we get an interesting answer. Amar le, Rav Nachman answered him and said, we're on the last line now of Yudalet Amabet, Hachi Amar Rav Yehuda Amara. This is what Rav Yehuda said in the name of Rav. Remember that it's Rav. We're going to have a lot of dealing with different opinions of Rav today, different versions of what Rav said. Bechronot shel Tzippori hayamasa. I mentioned Tzippori. So it happened in, what does the chronot mean? So usually it means like caravans or something like that. But what it means is on the day of the shuk, where there were a lot of caravans that came through. Now, why should that matter? Well, Kid Rabbi Ami, the Amar Rabbi Ami. Okay, and then it goes like Rabbi Ami who said, as Rabbi Ami said, not only was it the day of the shuk. Now, what happens in the day of the shuk? All sorts of other people come into the city. So we have the majority of the city. Okay, the point is, by the way, they permitted her. It doesn't say that in the Mishna. The Mishna says, if Anshe Ha'ir work ksherim, okay, but the point is, they work ksherim, and not only were they ksherim, but the majority of the people who come to sell in the shuk were also ksherim. Now, why does this help? Because it's two majorities, okay? It's not enough to have one majority. That's what Rabbi Yehoshua said. Okay, now we're going to see that they held like Rabbi Yehoshua, which is strange because we generally hold like Rabban Gamliel. But they held like Rabbi Yehoshua, and they said, we're not going to believe her, and we're not going to go by rove. Okay, we're not going to say, oh, the majority of people are ksherim, so let's just assume. But in this case, we not only had the majority of people in the city, we also had the majority of people passing through the city on the day of the shuk. And therefore, we're going to rule based on two majorities, then we can permit it. If we have two majorities working in her favor, then she'll be allowed to marry a kohen. And now we're going to see Uchi de Rabbi Yanai, and like Rabbi Yanai says, to Amar Rabbi Yanai, Niv'elet b'kronot kshera l'kehuna. If she had relations, now we're not talking about rape, we're just talking about a woman. Again, question of before, which was a woman has relations with a man, right? We had the woman who was pregnant. We had all sorts of women. They have relations with a man. The question is, can we assume they're kshirim? Well, if she was niv'elet b'kronot in a caravan, she's kshera l'kehuna. So first the Gemara says, b'kronot tzakadatach, but it matters what the location was, whether it was in a caravan, whether it was, what does that make any difference? Ella, they fix it to say, no. What they meant was, niv'elet b'shat kronot kasher l'kehuna. Okay, and that's Rabbi Yanai. We're going to continue with Rabbi Yanai in a minute, but basically what we're showing here is that Rabbi Yanai fits in perfectly with what we just said, that Rav said, that Rabbi Yehuda said, that Rav said, which is, it happened in the kronot, in the time of the shuk, the day of the shuk, when there were a lot of people coming through, because we had both people coming through and people in the city, and the majority of both of those were working in her favor to say he was kasher, therefore we're going to permit it. Aval, continues Rabbi Yanai to say, Perash echad mitzippori ubal. But if somebody comes from the city of Tzippori and it's clear they're a city dweller, and we only have one majority to go in their favor, havlad shtuki. Then we say the vlad is a shtuki. We don't know what the status of the child is. It's interesting, until now we've been talking about the status of the woman, but it's all the one and the same. If she ends up pregnant and there's a child, again, the child will be an unknown father, right? Meaning we don't know even if he's kosher, right? It's not like we can assume he's a Yisrael, and can marry. We maybe a mom's there, right? Then we can't go by majority, not for the child and not for obviously also her marrying a kohen. And now we're going to see someone else who says this. He had the Chiyata Rav Dimi, Amar Zeira, Amar Rabbi Chanina. When Rav Dimi came from Israel, he passed down in the name of Zeira in the name of Rabbi Chanina. And some people say, Amrela, Amar Zeira, Amar Rabbi Chanina, that not that Rav Dimi told us, but we heard straight from Rabbi Zeira, Rabbi Zeiri. Holchin acharov ha'ir ve'ein holchin acharov si'ah. Right now, we're not going to understand this. The Gemara is going to say this makes no sense, but let's just explain the words. We follow the majority of the city, but we don't follow the majority of the passersby. Now, before we go on, you have to learn some basics, which if you've already been learning daf from the beginning of the cycle, we've already learned this a few times. There's a very famous case of 9 stores. Okay, when we talk about spekot, we always talk about these 9 kosher stores and 1 non-kosher store, or the reverse. And we have, it's really 10 stores, right? It's always called Tesha Chanuyot, but it's really 10 because it's 9 plus the 1. And the question is, you bought food in one of these and you're not sure which one you bought it in. There's 2 cases, okay? One is you bought food in one of the stores, you don't know which one. The other case is you find a piece of meat on the street in between these 10 stores, and you want to know, is it kosher or not? So if you find a piece of meat in the middle between these 10 stores, it's called kol de parish. The meat is already not in its regular place. It's separated from the main place, right? It's now in the middle of the street. We don't know where it came from. And then we say, okay, well, what are the chances? If there's 9 kosher stores and 1 non-kosher store, chances are it's kosher because 9 out of 10. And therefore we can go by majority. It doesn't even have to be 9 out of 10, right? It could be any majority. You can eat that piece of meat. But if you went into a store and you just don't remember which store did you go into, and you're now sitting with a bag in your hand, okay, no receipts in those days that said on it which store you shopped in, you don't know which store of all these stores you went to, then we call that kol kavua. Anything that's kavua, if you went to somewhere in its set place, then we say kemechzal mechzadami. It's 50-50, because the question is not what are the chances are that you went into a store that was kosher. We don't look at it that way. We look at it as that's in its set place. And the question is, did you go into the kosher store or did you not, right? Did the store you go into, was it kosher or was it not? That's a 50-50 chance. Now, why this all works, the logic behind it, there's many different theories about why the difference, because theoretically one could argue, what's the difference? It's all a matter of probability and statistics and, what are the chances are. So I'm going to leave that question aside for today because we don't have enough time to really delve into it. You can look up articles about it. There's different theories, okay, in the commentaries, and then the way modern people understand those commentaries in terms of why there's a difference, but let's just accept right now that there's a difference. The main difference is if it's in a set place, then we view it as 50-50. If it's moving more like it's separated from its main place and it's not in its regular habitation, so to speak, then we go by majority. So let's look at what Rav Dimi said. You follow the rov of the city, which is kavua, in its place. And we don't follow the rov of the passersby. That's really the opposite of this whole theory. Now, it happens to be, it's a different usage of kavua and called a parish, but it's still similar because it's saying there's those who are in their place, in their habitation. That's why I call it before habitation, because here it really works. They're in their main city. And then there are those who came from somewhere else. So it seems like you should say the opposite. Kapelaya, the Gemara says. Makes no sense. The people from outside the city are the ones who are moving. We're always more lenient with moving. We follow majority with moving items. It's the ones that are set in their place that we don't follow majority. Ella, so they reinterpret what he said, and they said he must have said the following. Okay, they obviously changed his words a lot, but they still have this rov ir and rov si'ah. And what do they say? You follow the majority of the city, but only if it's a day of the shuk, and there's also people running through, and there's also a majority of ksherim there. Okay, and then it matches exactly what we said previously. Both Rav said that it was in Tzippori, and there were two rovs, and both Rabbi Yana said that if it's b'shak chronot, yes, but not if it's not. That basically you need the combination of the two. Now there's one thing left to explain. He says now, but you can't follow, and this is explaining Rav Dimi, you can't follow one majority of just the city. And you also can't follow if you have one majority of people passing through the city. Like let's say you know that you have relations with someone who came in for the shuk. Somehow you know that. You still can't follow majority. Now, what did we say before? That theoretically is naide, it's moving. Moving majorities, you should be able to follow the rov because they're not in their place, right? And it's one of these passersby, we should be able to follow majority. So the Gemara is going to say my time. So why don't we follow the majority of the rov si'ah, the majority of people coming through the city? Again, this isn't our case, because our case was we don't know whether it was from the city or was from those people. It would have to be a case where we knew something transpired having to do with the majority of the people who came. It was definitely someone who came from the outside. We just don't know which one it was. Can we follow majority? So what the Gemara is going to say now is we don't follow the majority, but theoretically we really could. Why don't we? Because we can't follow the majority of people in the city, because that's a kavua majority, we're going to be stringent and not allow a case where where it's clear she had relations with someone who came from the outside, but we don't know who it is. Even if there's majority, theoretically, we should say, called the parish, miruba parish, it's majority rules, but we don't, because if we allow that, we're worried that people will allow the majority in the city. So therefore, we basically are strict with that as well. That's how the way explained Rav Dimi. Now, Rov ha'ir nami, now they say, wait, and if I told you before, it's not exactly the same as kol kavua, okay, I'll tell you why it's not really the same. Because if we say that anyone in the city is always going to be kavua, well, then the stores and the meat from the stores theoretically should always be kavua, because the meat came from one of the stores. We just don't know which one. If I went into a store, we said 50-50 because the stores are kavua. If I find a piece of meat sitting there, and likely it came from one of these stores, right? Then called a parish, miruba parish wouldn't be true if we said, well, all the people in the city are stationary. Also, the meat in the city is stationary because it comes from one of the stores. And there's something a little off here. And that's why the Gemara says, rov ha'ir nami, even the rov of the city, it depends on the scenario. Now we're going to really compare it to the 9 stores. Here we have a woman. Again, we're not talking about a rape case. We're talking about a woman who has relations with a random man in the city. And right, she's not married. And the whole question is, can she marry a kohen or not? Because was she nivela to a kasher or to a pasul? So they say, if they left their house and went to this woman in her house, well, that would be what? What case would it be? It wouldn't be kavua anymore. They left their house. just like the meat left the store and somehow it's sitting in the middle here and we don't know from which store it came from. That wouldn't be kavua, called a parish, miruba parish. We have a random man on the street that came from one of these houses. We don't know which house he came from and which family he belongs to. So that's a case of called a parish. So even though we distinguish Rav Chiya and Rav Yehoshua splits into two. Rav Yehoshua could be a case of called a parish that we would follow the majority. So therefore, they say lo tzricha. When they say Rav Yehoshua is forbidden, what they mean is deka'az la'ihi l'gabayim. She went into, again, we're comparing this to the store. She went into the house of one of these men, had relations with him, and the whole question is, we don't know which house she went into and which man it was. So that's havele kavua, and then we say kol kavua k'mechzal mechzadame, and then we can't go by majority. Va'amar Rabbi Zeira. Now comes in Rabbi Zeira, kol kavua k'mechzal mechzadame. So he also says this law that's very famous, that kol kavua k'mechzal mechzadame. Soon we're going to quote him as even saying something a little bit longer, where he's going to say bein lekula, bein lechumra, and we're going to have to say, what is a case of lekula? We know a case of lechumra, which we just said of the 9 stores. And then instead of saying, well, 9 out of 10 chances are this piece of meat, right? The store I went into and bought the piece of meat was a kosher store. We're stringent and we say, kol kavua k'mechzal mechzadame. So we're going to have to figure out what's the kula, but that's later. Right now, they seem to quote just the first part of what he said. So now they say, wait a minute. Umi be'inan shrei rube. Now, wait a minute. Rabbi Zeira says, kol kavua k'mechzal mechzadame. Right? Now, do you need, now, in our case, I misread. That the Rabbi Zeira is the end of the previous statement. Sorry, my mistake. When they say lo tzricha deka'az la'ihu l'gabayu da'ave lekavua ba'amar Rabbi Zeira kol kavua k'mechzal mechzadame. Period. My mistake. I read it wrong. That's part of the last section. Now the Gemara is asking a different question. We're going to get back to Rabbi Zeira soon. Umi be'inan shrei rube. Wait a minute. Our Mishna says you need 2 rows. Now, if you remember when we learned this sugya before, and whatever I've been telling you about the Tesha Chanuyot, nobody ever said anything about 2 majorities. Right here we have a woman who was raped by someone outside in the fields, not in their house. They're not kavua. So it's right, it goes by rov. But we need 2 majorities. We need rov anshei ha'ir, and we need rov of the people passing through in order to permit her. Now, that doesn't sound at all like what we know of laws of majority. Since when do we need 2 majorities? The Hatanya, doesn't it say in a Braita? And now we're quoting, the main sugya is really in Chulin, a long time to get there. Tesha chanuyot, it comes up in many other places as well. Tesha chanuyot, kulam mochot basar shchuta ve'echad mocheret basar nevela. So here's our case that I said. 9 stores who all sell shechted meat, meaning kosher butchers. 1 that sells nevela, okay, animals that aren't slaughtered properly. And you bought from one of them, and you don't know from which you bought. We're going to be strict because that's kavua. You went into a store that was in its place and you bought, and we just don't know, was it the kosher one, was it not? But if you find a piece of meat in the middle, halacha chararot, you follow majority. Now, what do you see here? We follow 1 majority. Nobody ever said anything about 2 majorities. And if you want to say, now, I did say before that we're assuming the meat came from one of these 10 stores. But theoretically, you find a piece of meat on the street just because it happens to be near 10 butcher shops. Doesn't mean it came from that butcher shop. Maybe this is a case of 2 rows. Maybe the doors of the city aren't locked, which means that meat could come from anywhere else. And it could come from somewhere outside of the city. And maybe it's a case where most of the meat that comes into the city from outside the city, meaning most of the people who come into the city are Jewish. And therefore, I don't think of a ghetto or something, right? Because where you have a place where you can know exactly who's coming in and who's coming out. But if the doors are open and the people come in, and therefore the meat could theoretically be from somewhere else, and maybe there are 2 majorities here. But you can't say that because, right, and then deka'ate leruba me'alma, and then there's another row coming from the outside. Ha'amar Rabbi Zeira. Rabbi Zeira said, "Afal pi shadaltot medina ne'ulo." Right, period. Rabbi Zeira said, even if The doors of the city are closed, locked, and no one else comes into the city. And just, this really sounds like a ghetto, right? And all the meat in the city is only from kosher store, right? Only from, again, well, now it's not exactly a ghetto because there is one non-kosher meat butcher shop. But this is all you have. You don't have any other stores besides this. Then you can still follow the rove. So there aren't two roves here. So how do we answer this question? Similar to what we did a few days ago, or I don't remember which stuff it was anymore. But why is Rabbi Yehoshua strict in this case? Because ma'ala asu b'yuchtin. Here she wants to marry a kohen. When it's a matter of kosher meat, even though we all consider kashrus a very serious issue, but regular laws of majority kick in. When it comes to marrying a kohen, and we want to be careful that he marries someone with proper lineage and doesn't have something wrong with their lineage, like they have relations with somebody who was forbidden, then we're going to be strict. And only with two majorities are we going to permit it. Gufa. Now we're going to go back to this line of Rabbi Zeira that I said we get back to. Amar Rabbi Zeira, kol kavua kemechza mechtzadame. And here I told you we're going to get to this line, the end of it, which they didn't quote before, bein lekula, bein lechumer, whether we're lenient or whether we're stringent. So the Gemara wants to know, minale le Rabbi Zeira, where does he get this? That whether you're strict or whether you're lenient. In other words, the real question is, how do we know that it's also lekula? So really, until now, we've seen kol kabul kemechza mechtzadame is to be strict. You have 9 stores that are kosher, 1 that's not kosher. We don't allow you to eat. If you're not sure which store you went into, we don't allow it. That's lechumah. So the question is, right, if we have a Tanaitic source about this, where did this Amora come up with this bein lekula? What case would be a kula case? So first they say, so manale the Rabbi Zeira, where does he get this from? If you want to say our case that we've been discussing all along, 9 kosher stores, 1 not kosher. Took from one he doesn't know where he bought. Lakach is to buy. He purchased from one he doesn't know from which one. Right? It's forbidden. That obviously is l'chumra because 50-50 chance. That's not the case we're talking about. That's the kol parish miruba kaparish. But hatam l'chumra, that's a stringency. And likewise, this next case is also going to be a stringency. Frogs, if you have a dead frog, it's not matame. But if you have one of these shmona shratzim, 8 creatures that the Torah lists as their dead bodies cause tumah, so let's say you have 9 frogs and 1 sheretz who becomes, makes you tameh. So they're in their set place, right? The place where they died. And you touched one of them. So same thing. We're going to be strict and say it was a 50-50 chance. It was either yes, you touched the tameh one, or no, you didn't, even though 9 were pure. Hatamnami l'chumra. So it can't be from there. That's also, kavua kemechza mechtzadame is a stringency. Ela, it must be from this case. There were 9 shratzim that were forbidden and only 1 frog that wasn't. And now let's see what happens. Before we get to this, you have to know a basic halacha. When it comes to tumah and safek, whether you were tameh, whether you became impure, we have a rule. It's learned out from the sota. A sota also, they use the language of nitma'ah, okay, that she slept with a man who was defiled. And there, when is she convicted? If she was alone in the room with a man, in hiding, secret. Therefore, they learn laws of tumah from her. If you have a suffix about tumah and it's in a private space, it's forbidden, just like the sota. But if it's in a public place, imagine a sota is, the man is suspicious she's with some man. She talks to him in the shuk in public. He can't claim, oh, you slept with the man. She's in public, right? So likewise, tumah in public sphere is pure. So now with that background, let's see. Here you have 9 shratzim and 1 sfardea. Naga be'echamim, you touched one of them and you don't know which one. So now we say, kol kabua kemechza mechza. It's 50-50. 50-50 means safek. What are the rules of safek? Well, b'reshut yachid, if it was in a private domain, sfekot tameh, we're going to be strict. But here comes the kula. B'reshut harabim, since it's a 50-50, sfekot tahor, and we don't go by the fact that 9 of them were shratzim. And chances are you touch one of the 9. So this is where we go likula. Now they want to know, where do you have, so first they wanted to know, where does he get that it's likula? And we found a case where it would be likula. Now we want to know, is there a source in the Torah for this? And in fact, we're going to find one. Midoraita Menalan. Okay, if you're racking your brain and trying to think where the Torah did they talk about kol kavua kamech tzal matzadami, you're not going to find it. But they come up with a creative example, a creative way of understanding. Amar Kra v'aravlo v'kamala. This is a pasuk that's talking about when you go to the Ir Miklat, when it's accidental death and when it's intentional death. When is it intentional that you're going to get the death penalty? If you ambushed someone and killed them. Now, why does it say that? Ashi kavenlo. According to Tanakama, this is not relevant for our sugya at all, but they're bringing it. He said that means if I intended to kill a particular person, and let's say I shot a gun and I missed and I killed the person next to him, I wouldn't be liable to the death penalty according to Tanakama, because unless I intended to kill that person, I'm not liable. Comes Rabbanan, and they say, Amrei debe Rabbi Yanai, prat lezorek even lego. That's not coming to exclude that case. If I intend to kill one person, I killed someone else, I intended to kill. Of course, I get the death penalty. It doesn't matter who I killed. But if I threw a rock into a crowd of 10 people, and it was very arbitrary, I just threw it, maybe to kill, but sort of not intent. Now, you have to know some basic halachas. Part of this stuff is going to be, besides the rape we started with, we're going to also have some difficult issues with those sugyot that, again, don't sit with us well, about different treatment and halacha of Gentiles and Jews. If you kill a Gentile, you're not liable to the death penalty. Okay, we're not saying it's a good thing to do. We're just saying you don't get the death penalty for it. So if you threw a rock into a group of people, now we're going to have to see what kind of group of people, you're exempt if you killed someone. Hey, chidami, what's the case? Typically, if it was a case of 9 people that were non-Jewish and one that was Jewish, and you threw it in intending to kill, and then let's say, right, you didn't intend to kill the Jew, but you did. Well, inami palgu palga, even if it's half-half, safek nefasha lahaka. Whenever it comes to the death penalty, we're never going to do it unless we're sure. And since here, the majority of people were Gentiles, and even if it was 50-50, it would be safek. You don't even need that pasuk to tell you that. So what must it be? Lo tzricha diika tisha Yisraelim uknani echa benehem. Now those people are kavua, right? You have 9 Gentiles, 1 Jew among them. Tahave leknani kavua. Bekol kavua. Sorry, you have 9 Jews and 1 Gentile. And what do we say? Kol kavua kemechzal mechzadami. That's what the pasuk is telling you. Even if 9 of them were Jews and 1 was a Gentile, and you threw a rock in there intending to kill, but not anyone necessarily in particular, and you killed a Jew, even though 9 out of 10, right, you were probably intending to kill a Jew, since we hold kol kavua kemechzal mechzadami, you don't get the death penalty, because we view it as safek. Once we get into safek, 50-50, safek nefasha lahaka. We're not going to kill you based on a safek. So that's where we learn it from the Torah, from this pasuk of the arav lo v'kamala. Itmar. Now, okay, we learned our whole sugya. Let's just backtrack. We started with the story of the rape. We said, why do we go by rov? It must have been 2 rovs. Right now, imagine we didn't learn that, okay? We have to put it aside for 1 minute. Imagine we think the simple reading of the Mishna 1 rov. Even though Rav was the one who said it, we're now going to have a debate about Rav. Itmar was said. Rav Chiya bar Ashi says in the name, Amar Rav, says in the name of Rav, halacha ki Rabbi Yosi. We pass like Rabbi Yosi, that right now we're going to assume that we follow rov, and we're going to mean 1 rov. Okay, hold off on the fact that, what do you mean? We just said it's 2 rovs. Ignore that for right now. The Rav Chanan bar Rava Amar Rav, Rav Chanan bar Rava says in the name of Rav, we have a debate about Rav. Hora'at sha'aita. This was a unique situation that just relates to that one girl who was raped. They had a unique situation where they decided, for whatever reason, we don't really know why, there was a need to permit her to marry a kohen, and they did it. But we don't do this in general. So we have one person saying, we hold like Rabbi Yosi in general. We have one person saying, and the Rav says that. We have one person saying, Rav said, no. Just in that case, they held like Rabbi Yosi, but in general, we don't allow this. Mativ Rabbi Yirmia. Rabbi Yirmia comes and says, I don't get it. Don't you need 2 rovs in Yuchsin? How do we know this? Vahatzna, a Mishna in Machshirin. Matzaba tinok mushlach. You found a child on the street. Okay, we're talking about a lot of strange situations, right? Are random. You walk on the street, and all of a sudden you see an abandoned child. The question is this child a Jew or a Gentile? What's the relevance? We're going to see. There's a debate about what exactly the relevance is. The Mishna doesn't tell us. If most of the people in the city are Gentiles, you can assume the child's a Gentile. Rov Yisrael, most of the majority of the people if the majority of the people are Jews, you can assume it's a Jew. Mechza al mechza Yisrael. If it's 50-50, then you assume it's a Jew. Okay? Now, Amarav, Lo Shanu Ela Lahachayoto. This whole law that we go by the Rov is only for laws of sustaining this child, meaning we have again, these are all these rules that are going to be different for Jews and non-Jews. We have a law, it says, your brother has to live with you. That means you have to help support any Jews in your area, right? Or Jews in general. You have a mitzvah to support. You see someone who needs help, you have a mitzvah to support them. That only applies to Jews. So if we find this child on the street, are we commanded? Again, you can do whatever you want. Of course, you can say, even if the kid's Gentile, we should support them. The question is, you obligated to support the child. So we go by majority. Aval yuchsin lo. Comes Rav and he says, by yuchsin, we don't follow majority rules. You can't say, oh, majority of the people in the city are Jews. Let's let this child marry a kohen. Because again, if they want to marry a regular Jew, so at least, okay, do a giur l'chumra, right? Convert them. But if they're a convert, they can't marry a kohen. So basically, they can't marry a kohen. Now, what do you see here? Rav himself says, for yuchsim, we don't go by majority. So that's Rabbi Yirmia's question. Before we get to the answer, Shmuel amar l'fakech alav tagal. Shmuel says it's for this halacha if an avalanche happened on Shabbat and this person is stuck under all the rocks. Again, are we commanded to desecrate Shabbat to save this person? Only if they're Jewish. So again, we're going to go by majority or this mechza al mechza, 50-50. Yes, if it's Shabbat, we're going to basically be allowed to do that. We'll get back to Shmuel soon. It's a little difficult. We'll get back to him in a minute. So now, they say to Rabbi Yirmia, now I told you to forget that whole sugya we learned, now remember it. They say to Rabbi Yirmia, why do you think that when Rav Pascal like Rabbi Yosi, he was holding by one majority? Did you forget? It was in the day of the shuk, there were two majorities. So why are you bringing a question from Machshirin, which seems to say you need two majorities, and this says only one? Who says Rav said only one? No, when Rav Pascal like Rabbi Yosi, he meant two majorities, right? It was the chronot of Tzippori. Now we have a bit of a problem with the other opinion of Rav, though. Uli Rav Chanan ba Rav da'amar hora'at sha'aita kashya, right? Kashya ha. So now they say, wait a minute. If that's the case, so the first opinion of Rav says when there's two majorities, we follow majority. Comes the second opinion of Rav that we saw at the bottom of Amud Aleph, and he said, right, Rav Chanan bar Rav said it was a hora'at sha'ah. Hora'at sha'ah means they only did it this time. What did they only do this time? Now you have to say it the reverse. They only made you hold by two rows this time. But if there was one row, in a regular case, it would be fine, meaning they were extra strict in this case for some reason. Well, then the Mishna makes no sense in Machshirin because he's basically saying the Rav thinks one majority is enough. And how does that fit with the fact that Rav said the case in Tzippori was two majorities? This whole thing doesn't make, right? And how does it fit with the Mishna Machshirin? It doesn't work. So what do they say? Rav Chanan bar Rav, who said in the name of Rav that there was a hora'at sha'ah, didn't hold by the first statement of Rav that it was the chronot shel Tzippori. And what does he say? He says it was really just one row, with a simple reading of the Mishnah. He didn't have that other statement of Rav. So he read the Mishnah through Rav's eyes as saying the Mishnah was one row. And therefore, he said it was hora'at sha'ah to permit one majority, but general, we can only permit in two majorities. And then in the end, he's really saying the same thing as the other opinion. Okay, but they each have a different interpretation of what the case was. There's a lot of confusion here, just so you can see, right? It's clear that nobody, right? There was a lot of different opinions about what Rav held. This, by the way, when you have a very prominent rabbi with many, many students, you often have this scenario where there's a big debate about what exactly the Rav said. Gufa. Now we're going to go back to Shmuel. So again, we're just going to first read the whole Braita again. Matzaba tinok mushlach, you find a child on the street. Imrov of de kochavim, Rav Yisrael. Mechza, Yisrael. Majority Gentile, majority of Jew, you assume Jews. If it's 50-50, you assume it's a Jew. Amarav lo shanu ela lachioto aval yuchsin lo. That's just Rav, we already said that. And Shmuel amar lefakech alav tagal. Shmuel says it's to save them on Shabbat. Umi amar Shmuel hachi. Wait a minute. Hamar Rabbi Yosi, how could Shmuel say that? If, let's say, 49% of the people are Jews and 51% are Gentiles, and there's an avalanche, and people are stuck underneath, and we don't know whether they're Jews or Gentiles. We're just going to say, look, chances are they're Gentiles, so we can't save them on Shabbat. That's crazy. Hamar of Yosef, Hamar of Yudah, Amar Shmuel. Didn't Rabbi Yosef say in the name of Rabbi Yehuda, in the name of Shmuel? When it comes to saving a life, okay, forget about what we're thinking, what he means, save a life of a Gentile also. Okay, put that aside because, again, that's the way the halacha views it. But it's hard, right? It's hard to swallow that. But let's just take that as a given. Again, you have to remember also someone on the background of sources talk about, in those days, there were Gentiles trying to kill us. So one can maybe see it in the light of that. Why save someone who's going to kill you? But anyway, they say if there's a 49% chance it's a Jew, what, we're going to let that potential maybe Jew die? No, we don't follow majority when it comes to pikuach nefesh. Of course you can save them. So therefore they change what Shmuel said. They say it can't be that Shmuel said that. What he was really talking about this line in Rav of Dei Kochavim, and this is what he said. In Rav of Dei Kochavim, if the majority of people, 51% are Gentiles, you assume they're a Gentile, and comes Shmuel and he says, Amar Shmuel, but not when it comes to when it comes to other issues, yes. But when it comes to allowing you on Shabbat to save the person's life, we don't go by the majority. We save them anyway, because on the off chance that they're a Jew, you're commanded to save. So then, so what is that line talking about? Can you feed the child non-kosher food? So you can, do you want to help this child because you're a good person, but you want to give them, let's say the non-kosher meat is, let's say you were slaughtering an animal and you messed up and it's not kosher now. Can you give it to this child? So you can. If the majority of people are Gentiles, you can feed the kid non-kosher food. What about in Rav Yisrael l'may hilchata? The fact that you're commanded to return a lost item, that's a commandment also specifically for a Jew. Okay? The Gentile, if he wants to get it out of your hands, I think they have to basically, one second. Right? You don't have to return a lost item to a Gentile. Okay, so therefore, if you find something on the street, you can keep it if it's a Gentiles. If the majority of the people are Gentiles, let's say it belongs to this child, you don't have to return it. If the majority of people are Jews, then you have to return it. What about this 50-50? For damages. What kind of damages? So now the Gemara is going to say, hey, Chidami, what's the case? So you need some background in this. Again, difficult halacha, but there's different laws. If my ox gored your ox or your ox gored my ox, and let's say I'm Jewish and you're Gentile. So if there's a person who's Jew and their ox gored someone else's ox, okay, a Jewish ox. Let's take the basic case. My ox gores your ox. He hasn't done this 3 times yet. He's called a short time. I pay half damages. Okay, once it's 3 times, then I'm really expected to wash my animal. And if I don't, I have to pay full damages. If my ox gored a Gentile's ox, okay, then I'm not obligated at all. And if a Gentile's ox gored my ox, okay, you see there's a lot of imbalance here, then the Gentile, we can bring the Gentile to our courts and make the Gentile pay full damages. What authority we have to insist that this Gentile follow our rules, I don't know. But if a Gentile, theoretically, in a court, we can convict a Gentile to pay full damages. Even though a Jew would pay only half damages to the other Jew, the Gentile is obligated for full damages. So now you're going to see why this matters, whether we say what we follow here. So if it's 50-50, we're going to say it's Jewish, so let's see what this is. Hechidami. If it's our shore, the gored their shore, and then we want to say, well, their shore, meaning this child, and we don't know is the child Jewish or not. If they want to take money out of our hands and say you owe me half damages rather than, saying you're a Gentile and we don't owe you anything. Well, you want to claim I owe you money. Well, prove that you're Jewish and then I'll have to pay you the money. But until you prove it, you can't take money out of my hands without proving it. So it must be a case. Their shore gored this child's ox gored mine. Palga mishalem. Okay, so firstly, they're at least, if they're a Gentile, they have to pay full damages. If they're a Jew, they have to pay half damages. Half, for sure, they pay. Now, if we say Palga the Palga Yisrael, then the second half they don't have to pay. So Idach Palga Amalei Amalahu Aituraya Delav Yisrael Anava Eten Lichon. This child can say, look, prove to me that I'm a Gentile and I'll pay you the other half, but until you prove it, I'm basically a Jew for this purpose. And that's what it means Mechza Mechzi is Jewish. But if his shore gored, his ox gored mine, then I can't make him pay the full damages as if he's a Gentile, because it's 50-50. So until he proves he's a Gentile, until I prove he's a Gentile, I can't get the money. And with that, Hadran Allah B'tulani say. Finish the first chapter of Ketubot. Okay, now we're going to, so what you see here is a lot of, right, we're ending with this whole issue of spekot and doubts, right? And as I said, already this page raised a lot of doubts because there's a lot of things you can see. There was a lot of lack of confusion. Even Rav and Shmuel are arguing here. What exactly is this, right? When it says rov and mechza, and who are we talking about for what purposes, for which halachot? And you see that it's not so, lots of times we like things to fit into a box. They don't exactly fit into a clear box in today's daf. Okay, next, new chapter, which is a little bit continuing the previous, with the main topic of this chapter is going to be something called Hapesh Asar or Hapesh Yitil. I'm going to explain that more tomorrow because today's daf doesn't really deal with it, just the very bottom, which we're going to leave for tomorrow, the last two lines, which is really this idea, I'll just tell you in a nutshell, which is if I provide information that you wouldn't have had without me, and then I say, but we accept my but because without my first statement, we wouldn't have anything, right? So if I say, it looks like this, but that it's different than what it looks like. And since I'm providing all the information about it, and we don't have witnesses otherwise, we believe me. Okay, but we're going to get to a whole machloket about this and how this affects, where this comes up in our cases. But first, we're going to start with Isha Shenit Almana or Shenit Garsha. We have a woman, we're continuing along with these cases that we just don't know what the situation is, and there's counterclaims. So we have a woman who became widowed or divorced. Hi omeret betulani satani. Now, what's the issue? We don't have her ketubah in front of us, okay? Now, there's a rule that if you don't have a ketubah, there clearly was a ketubah, or even if they didn't write a ketubah, it's what we call t'nai beitin. The beitin will insist to give her the money anyway. Question is, how much money? We don't know. Was she a betula? Was she a virgin and had a ketubah of 200 zuz? Or was she not a virgin and had a ketubah of 100 zuz? So she says, betulani satani. I was a betula, I was a virgin when I got married. Now, it's either he or he's dead. If he's dead, right, if he divorced her, he could be there. If he's dead, it's his inheritors, his heirs, who say, Loki ela almana nisaticha. No, you were an almana. You, at the time, forget about now you're an almana, or now you're a grusha, but then, before the first marriage, you were not a virgin. Im yesh edim. So now how do we determine who's right? Well, im yesh edim. Now we're going to learn all sorts of customs about in the time of the Mishna, and we're going to see, I say specifically in the time of the Mishna, because the Gemara is going to say, what about in Babylonia now? There were certain customs that were prevalent specifically at weddings of virgins that they didn't do at other weddings, okay, weddings of non-virgins. So if there's witnesses, sheyatzat bihinuma, okay, we try to find witnesses that were at the wedding, or they don't have pictures like we do nowadays. They try to find witnesses who could say, oh yeah, I was at the wedding, and I remember she came out with her hinuma. What hinuma is, we'll see, wait for the Gemara. Rosha Parua, her hair was wild, long. It was also the way they would go to their weddings with uncovered hair. Ktubata matai. Then these are all signs that she was a betula at the time. Even the food was different. They would hand out these candied, like toasted, like you go to these pitzuchiot in Israel, all these nut stores, these roasted nuts and roasted grains. It was a snack. We've seen it. We saw it in Pesach. They would hand it out to the children to keep the children from asking at the Seder. So they would give out these klayot at the weddings of virgins. So if people said, oh yeah, we ate klayot, then, right, they remember, people always remember the food. They come back, that's what people talk about at the wedding. How good was the food? They remember they ate this. So that can be proof as well. Okay, we'll stop here because then the next thing is a whole other topic. The second part of the Mishnah, we will get to that in tomorrow's daf. Have a great day, everybody.